Welcome to Rodera. Today we are talking with Professor Barak D. Richman and the author of the book Stateless Commerce, The Diamond Network and the Persistence of Relational Exchange. Professor Richman is an Edgar P. and Elizabeth C. Bartlett Professor of Law and Business Administration at Duke University School of Law. Welcome to Rodera.
Thanks so much for having me.
You have worked a long time, probably over a decade, on this topic about the kind of an ethnic and old-time network that is still persisted. Tell us what the book is all about, and if you can also draw a little bit of more broader context that what this industry is, why did you get into it, what was so attractive or not attractive, or what piqued your interest?
Sure. So I think the first question I had was a fascination with the industry, and specifically trying to ask the question or trying to answer the question, how does the industry work in a reliable way? How is it that diamond transactions are securable, are reliable, are trustworthy? And taking a step back, the question that I asked is a paradigmatic economist question. The question is, in a world where credit sales are so essential, everybody buys things on credit, especially in the diamond sector where everything is volume, where the actual value of goods that are being transacted are enormously high. When credit sales are engaged, how are they enforced? If one diamond dealer sells another diamond dealer's diamonds on credit, A gives B diamonds and B promises A to pay in the future, how does A know that B is going to pay? How does A know that after giving B diamonds, how does A know that B is not going to just run off to the rest of the world and take those diamonds with them? This is a commodity, an asset that is enormously valuable, easily transportable, virtually impossible to trace. On the most rudimentary level, how does A know that B is going to pay? And that was the immediate question. And it's a question that an economist asks, and it's a question that I think a lawyer is especially interested in, because lawyers, of course, are the administrators of credit. They know how to devise documents, contracts, security instruments, where those sorts of credibility issues, those credit sales, are enforced. But the diamond industry doesn't rely on any of those, and I think it's quite obvious why they don't rely on any of them, because they're totally useless. A contract or a legal promise to pay somebody $1 million after already taking possession of diamonds, sure, the person can go to the court, execute the judgment, but if the person's gone, that judgment is useless. So this is an instance where credit is an industry where credit is incredibly valuable and widespread, where legal instruments to secure credit are toothless, and nonetheless, where the industry seems to have transactions executed and enforced on a daily basis. So the economist asks a very simple question, how are these transactions enforced? And the legal scholar says, especially since the legal system in this particular case isn't useful. And that's how I first was attracted to the industry, and that was the first question that I asked. Now, the answer to those questions brings us into the mechanics and the institutions in the diamond industry. This is a world where family businesses are predominant, where ethnic networks prevail, and you have a very simple solution to a very important question. How are promises kept? They're kept because we know who the transactors are. We know that if diamond merchant B fails to pay diamond merchant A, diamond merchant B will be disconnected from the industry and in fact, and also punished by diamond merchant B's community. We have informal enforcement. We have extra legal enforcement. And it's only because the communities and the families are so enmeshed in this industry do we have ways to punish individuals who defect, who fail to keep their promises. So this is a world where pre-legal, extra-legal institutions are central to making sure that transactions and promises are fulfilled. And in that sense, it is a pre-legal, almost a pre-modern form of economic organization, where families and communities are the real instruments of coercion or the real instruments of enforcement. So that's how I got to the industry. That's what first attracted me to the industry. And that was the first scholarly question that I asked. And then maybe the more probing question is the question that you introduced the conversation with a minute ago. If this is in fact a pre-legal mode of economic organization, why is it that it is persisted into the modern era? And why is it that we see it still predominate in areas like New York, like Antwerp, like Hong Kong, places where alongside these pre-modern forms of economic organization, we have the quintessential modern economy? How is it that the pre-modern lives side by side with the modern, and why is it persisted to the current day? And that, I think, is the more probing question, the more challenging question that really is the core question that is asked and answered by the book.
And as we go further, we will find out the amount of work you put into it and the number of people you have talked around the world. And we would certainly like to understand, what did you learn and how did you carry out all that work? The title of the book is interesting, Stateless Commerce. And what do you mean by it? There are certain other terms that I can think of, and like lawless commerce, or I can also think of credit network. I can also think of affinity network or community network. But you chose this term for a reason. Explain to us, please.
Yeah. In many ways, the title of the book and the way you phrase it suggests the real question I'm trying to answer. So we see throughout the economy, both formal and informal, we see the allocation of credit. We see credit is just another form of cooperation, where one person lends another person money for a certain economic activity, and then that person, after profiting from that activity, pays back the previous person. This is a form of collaboration, a form of cooperation. And we see the extension of credit as a form of cooperation in really every industry, in every economic enterprise. Before we had courts, before we had an established system where individuals who really do not know each other and don't know each other intimately or personally, those individuals can cooperate. And in many sense, that is what modern courts and modern contracts are about. They're about enabling cooperation among strangers. A does not know B. A does not know B's family, does not know what B's real motives are. But if A has a contract with B, then A can hold B and make B keep B's promises. The emergence of state-sponsored courts has enabled the kinds of cooperation that were not possible before these courts emerged. So when we think of credit and credit networks, there are lots of ways to think about them. We can think about them through the informal sector, through families and communities, but we can also think about them through the formal sector. And basically, Wall Street is all about creating and accumulating capital to enable cooperation. Most cooperation, most credit, is supported now by the formal sector through the execution of agreements in state courts. And what's fascinating about the diamond sector is that it is stateless in the sense that it does not rely on the instruments, the public instruments of modern commerce. It does not rely on the state and the enforcement and state enforcement of agreements through state courts. There has been a literature using the term lawlessness instead of statelessness. But there are two problems with the term lawlessness. One is that when two diamond merchants come into an agreement, they are creating a legal agreement. They're creating a legal obligation. So it is not a lawless agreement. What's distinctive about the agreements between diamond merchants is that that legal instrument is unenforceable by the state. The state, through its physical, mechanical limitations, just simply cannot enforce that agreement. So what's unique about the diamond sector is not the absence of law. It's the absence of the state to enforce the law. And in that sense, the real distinction, the real phenomena that I'm trying to understand in the diamond sector is this notion of statelessness, how industries can thrive without the state and without state support, without state courts especially. And it also highlights the real puzzle here, because most political scientists, most development economists believe that the emergence of the state, of the modern state, has been extraordinarily important to economic development. And you might even say the growth of the prosperity in the Western world. And here's an industry that deliberately shuns the state, that deliberately, or I think as a de facto matter, finds the state totally unhelpful. So if, in fact, industries into the modern era thrive as stateless industries, then it raises the very question, is, in fact, the state as useful as we think it is?
For those of us who are listening to this discussion right now, we know to appreciate what Professor Richman is trying to explain. And let me inject a couple of things here. Diamond is a global commodity. It is mined in one parts of Africa or Russia or Australia, and it travels through several channels, primarily nowadays through India for the processing. And then it comes to Antwerp, where it is added more value, or it finds another set of buyers or sellers who might meet there, or continue on further in New York, which happens to be one of the biggest markets in the world. So the diamond industry truly is a global industry, but at the same time, the participants in the marketplace are different ethnic networks. And that's where the complexity arises. And at the same time, these ethnic networks have found a way to communicate and work with each other over the centuries almost, and continue to do so just because the government sponsored or government sanctioned ways of doing things have not been found that attractive for those ethnic networks.
Yeah, that's exactly right. The diamond network, the diamond industry, and the networks that facilitate the diamond value chain is a quintessentially global industry. It's diamonds are mined in one place, cut and polished in another, sorted in another, set in jewelry in another, and sold in another. And as you described, a particular diamond will, going from mine to end consumer, will change hands upwards between 20 and 40 times, and will traverse the globe and be situated in as many as 5 to 7 countries. It's very, very common. That's the way it's commonly done. And it's interesting, if you think about it this way, if you think about commerce first beginning regionally and then nationally and then internationally and globally, and if you think that the global economy is something that is a relatively recent phenomena, something that has really taken hold after World War II, it is perhaps ironic, perhaps telling, that the most global of trades relies on a form of economic organization that is ancient. Maybe that's a play on words that just kind of pulls out an irony, but I think it's telling in the following sense. Because there really is no global legal enforcer. I mean, when there's a transaction between a party in the United States and a party in, say, France, it's actually not entirely obvious how you enforce that transaction. Somehow or another, you have to get the courts in France or the courts in the United States to enforce the agreement against the party that is outside the jurisdictional boundaries. It's difficult. So when you are talking about global commerce, there always is a question about governance. It is quite difficult to enforce agreements across national boundaries. So if you have a sector like the diamond industry that enforces agreements on its own, that already is stateless, that does not rely on the governments of France or the United States or any other to enforce agreements, they are especially well positioned to facilitate global commerce. So what we have here is an ancient, a pre-legal method of organization that actually has a real comparative advantage once markets have become globalized.
If you can give us a little bit of current state of diamond industry, in the sense that you have case studies of who are these players, who are the diamond network players or diamond tiers, and how they operate. Let's say they found $100,000 worth of diamond, which travels in different parts of the world to get to the retailer and then to the customer, which could become $100,000 diamonds, could become $600,000 diamonds. Tell us how the value is added, how the credit is created, and who are involved. Is it the Jewish network? Now it's the Palanpuri network, an ethnic minority out of India, or other networks are also involved, and how they facilitate the going from the origin to the final stop, which is the consumer.
Yeah. So you could think of the entire diamond trade as being divided into three segments: production, which is mostly mining; distribution, which are these intermediaries that the book really talks about, the focus is on, that I'll get to in a second; and then retail. So you have a mining interest that pulls diamonds out of the ground. Most, diamonds, natural diamonds all come from the ground. Now, there is an interesting emerging market on synthetic diamonds, which is basically where diamonds are made in the factory as opposed to mined from the ground. But diamonds are mined from the ground, and rough diamonds are cloudy and do not have a sparkle. So diamonds need to be cut or polished in particular ways to bring out the shine. And then once these diamonds are cut and often sorted, and they are done so through this network of intermediaries, and then they are sold to jewelry manufacturers. Jewelry manufacturers purchase individual stones, they set them, they put them in brooches or whatever, and then they're sold retail. Of the entire value chain, for diamond jewelry is about a $75 billion annual industry. About half of that goes to the mining interests. And this is where De Beers has occupied traditionally, has traditionally dominated this part of the marketplace. De Beers has always, until recently, it's been a monopolist, but it has always operated at the mining sector, at this first sector of the value chain. About half goes to mining, and about a third, perhaps more, goes to the retail, and especially any more goes to the high-end retail, the luxury retail, the Tiffany's of the world, the Louis Vuittons of the world. The remaining slice, if you think about half, about a sixth or closer to even an eighth of the remaining value is captured by these intermediaries. So already we see that of these three levels, it's the intermediary levels where their profit margins are the lowest, and also where there is the most competition. Although De Beers doesn't have a marketplace, doesn't have a monopoly anymore, there aren't a lot of big players in the mining sector. And on the retail sector also, you have certain designers and certain retailers that really dominate the marketplace. So these intermediaries tend to be the ones there where it is a very aggressive market. There are lots of different players, and they are the ones who convert these rough stones that are mined from the ground into polished stones that are then sold to jewelry manufacturers. These networks of intermediaries, as you described, are at once pre-legal. They are the ones that operate as a stateless sector, but also they have changed quite significantly even over the last century. If you were to go to the New York Diamond Center about in the 1920s, you would mostly see a Dutch or a Belgian set of business people who were organizing the industry. Amsterdam and then Antwerp were the diamond centers of the world before World War I and especially before World War II. If you were to go to New York in the 1950s, 1960s, you would see a predominantly Jewish-dominated diamond sector. And if you were to go now, you would see Belgian dealers, and yes, you would see a lot of Jewish dealers, but you would mostly see Palanpuri dealers. The Palanpuris come from Gujarat, which is on the Indian subcontinent. So over the last century, you've seen the method of organization for these intermediaries stay the same, but the composition of the intermediaries change in very interesting ways. Whereas before World War II, and again before World War I, Antwerp was the center of the diamond world, and actually in the 19th century it was Amsterdam. Most cutting in the 1950s and 60s was in Israel, and the networks were dominated by Israelis. And starting in the 1990s, most cutting in the world happened in India, in Gujarat, and now you see the Palanpuris and other Indian ethnic networks dominating the industry. So once you see pre-legal forms of organization, families and communities, but those families and communities are not exclusive to any particular community or religion or sect. And in fact, the composition of the industry has changed over time. That reflects, you might say, different trends and different forces in the global economy.
So in the $75 billion industry that we're talking about, that is a U.S.-sized portion of the industry, I'm assuming. And if that, or is it the global industry?
That's global, yeah.
That's global. Yeah. So about anywhere between $7 to $10 billion is the one that we're talking about. That's where these intermediaries get involved.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where these stateless networks operate, and that's where they add value or they rely on the credit network.
Exactly. That's exactly right.
And why that is the form of organization or the structure of the industry? Going to play a little cynical here. I say, well, let's look at cotton, let's look at grain, let's look at gold. These industries have evolved, and over the years, they got consolidated. There are only few players in the market at the producer level, and then at the processing level, and then, of course, there are the retail level. So those are the three, and the producing, processing, maybe distribution level. But in every way, there are generally 20% of the people who come to dominate the 80% of the market. This is generally how we noticed in most of these industries. What is so unique about diamond that we haven't seen that?
Yeah, it's a wonderful question. And you are right that even after the introduction of courts, you saw a lot of economic organizations similar to the diamond industry that's largely stateless, but many of those, cotton, gold, really have looked a lot more like the rest of the economy and have not relied on these community-based intermediaries as much as there have been in the past. So what is it about the diamond sector that makes it, and again, I think the appropriate question is the economist's question. Why is it that the diamond industry still persists in the way that it does, in spite of all of the economizing forces, the economic and technological forces that have changed every other industry? And I think the answer is explained with how the diamond network, how these intermediaries create value. What are their comparative advantages? In gold, you have a commodity. You have different kinds of carat gold. Similarly, for cotton, you have different grades of cotton, but they're much easier to codify. It's easier for someone in the mines of Brazil to communicate to somebody in the commodities market in Chicago what their grade gold is, what kind of gold they have, and how they can sell it. And diamonds are different. I mean, yes, all diamonds are valuable. And yes, diamonds, with the GIA, the Gemological Institute of America, there are certain grades. But diamonds, for the most part, are still different from each other. They are necessarily heterogeneous. And when you see diamond dealers trying to engage in sales, you see a lot of effort being put into personally evaluating the quality of the diamond. Diamantaires always carry loops. These are little magnifying glasses. They put it to their eye. They look at the diamonds. They look at the occlusion, the color, the way the light bounces off, the different facets. These are all in-person ways that diamonds are valued and assessed by diamantaires. So that's one thing. It's very, very hard to codify what a diamond is and how valuable, what its market price might be. It's very hard to do that without some kind of tacit in-person evaluation. And because valuation is such an imperfect science, individual diamantaires, these intermediaries, they make value. They make money by finding diamonds that are undervalued and matching them with buyers who will pay more than the average person for the diamonds. It's all a matching process. It's about finding diamonds and finding buyers and creating optimal connections. This is something that if you had a stock market, for example, you could probably do electronically. And that's why most stock markets have moved to electronic trading. Who wants to spend the most for a particular share of General Electric, for example? But if it's a matter of trying to find a particular buyer for a particular stone, that is something that requires a lot of individual attention. It requires a lot of market information. You need to have your network of buyers. You need to know who is looking for what. And it is a process that is very sensitive to effort. So it is at once a human exercise. It's not something that can be codified. It's not something where computers or robots can take over. But also it is something where the person who is most active, who meets the most people, who examines the most stones, who can quickly synthesize market information, understand how to utilize it to capitalize on certain opportunities given stones, these particular stones in their inventory, the market rewards that person. And that's why when you walk on 47th Street and see the New York Diamond District, or if you were to go to Mumbai and go to the Diamond Bourse there, or go to the streets of Gujarat and people walking around outside the polishing centers, you will see people scurrily and quickly running around trying to find buyers, trying to find stones, trying to make connections. And that is the kind of activity that is best optimized in a disintegrated market structure, a market structure where individuals and families and communities and networks all thrive instead of, say, the economic titans of JP Morgan or Morgan Stanley. We see the persistence of this kind of economic organization with individual merchants. We see it persist because of the demands of the diamonds trade, of what it takes to be able to make money as an intermediary.
Here's the cynic in me that is listening to you and thinking about it. So, well, I guess the same argument could be made by a wheat farmer or a corn farmer or a cotton grower. So, well, there are 5 levels of grades in cotton. There are levels of grade in wheat, and I conform to a certain kind of grade, and that because of that, I can price my product. And, I find a buyer, and there's a certificate or there's an appraiser, and once I have the appraiser, you could make the same argument for the real estate that, when you buy 2 houses, no 2 houses are similar, so you have to go and inspect it. But at the same time, more and more things happen online without really even being there. Or at least you have an agent you can do that. Why? Is it because the resistance of these diamond dealers to move on, or is it because truly that is the situation? Because, of course, they will tell you that the diamond is unique, diamond is special. Only if I touch it, I can see it. But we don't buy oranges or apples or bananas touching it. Nowadays, everything is shipped and delivered to you unseen.
Yeah, there have been efforts. So you're exactly right that there are enormous efficiencies to be gained by buying and selling over the phone or over the internet without touching it. Touching and inspecting something before purchasing it really is a significant transaction cost. And if you can turn that into an electronic platform, there'd be enormous efficiencies. And there have been efforts to do that in diamonds. There are some online retailers that, where you can look at a high resolution picture of a stone. There are some inventories where they've been put online. So this is a particular stone of a particular carat and color and cut. This is the quality. These are the GIA specs. And that's taken root a little bit, but it has not replaced the traditional avenues, the traditional ways of valuations. And I think that there's a reason for that. I think it's because all of these codifications are deeply imperfect, much less perfect than grades of corn or grades of cotton. Now, the real estate industry is very interesting. That is a situation where you still have a network of intermediaries. You still have realtors. And realtors make their money matching properties with optimal buyers. And there have been some efforts to move that online, and perhaps buyers and sellers can meet each other online instead of relying on realtors. And there's been some significant penetration, but realtors still are there, and they still serve a value-added purpose as matchmakers. And thinking about realtors and you could say the persistence of realtors as brokers of information, as matchmakers in a marketplace, the persistence of realtors, I think, can be explained in many of the same ways as the persistence of intermediaries in the diamond industry. The persistence of diamantaires can be explained also.
Mm-hmm. 2 other examples since we're on this track of discussion. Insurance. Before the World War I, Lloyd's of London It was all people walking around there in their tower and deciding, even before even the United States was created. A lot of insurance was, a lot of activity in this country was insured by the insurance company over there. And many of them, even the Panama Canal, we know what happened, how many people went bankrupt there. But yet the industry evolved and eventually became initially, it became more structured, more organized, more paperwork-based, and eventually digitized and became electronic. But why diamond dealers just won't let it go?
The diamond industry is not a sentimental industry. Yes, there might be some historical trajectories, but diamond merchants and diamond companies are as eager to innovate and to change business practices as any other. The persistence of pre-modern economic organization is not an expression of sentimentality. It's a consequence of efficiencies. This still is the most efficient way to organize the industry. Now, it's interesting, though, that if you think about insurance like Lloyd's of London, or especially investment bankers, there was a time before economic risks and economic projections were heavily dependent on computer models. There was a time when individual assessment was really central. Investment banks really were just accumulations of personal networks, and the investment bankers utilized these networks as a way of matching funders with projects that they believed would be profitable and were connected in ways that utilized much the same economic principles as we see in the diamond industry. So in that sense, this whole idea of having a network of intermediaries, a community of merchants that serve as some kind of warehouse or bourse or exchange market to connect buyers and sellers, to facilitate transactions along the value chain, it's as old as markets themselves. And to the degree that some markets have been able to utilize new technologies and have adjusted to those new technologies is something where we're always being pushed by the technological frontier. Now, the diamond industry, in spite of the fact that a lot of the codification and the promotion of electronic platforms have changed other industries and has not changed the diamond industry, you still have seen some penetration of those new technologies into the diamond industry. And one interesting example comes from De Beers itself. De Beers traditionally, and I think traditionally, I really mean up until about the year 2000 or 2002, was only a miner, only operated at the wholesale market. It mined the diamonds and then it sold diamonds to these intermediaries. They did so in London. And De Beers was also an advertiser. In fact, they were a brilliant advertiser, but they advertised worldwide to promote diamond consumption. They were the upstream monopolist. And even though nobody bought diamonds from De Beers directly, De Beers was the one that indirectly profited from every diamond sale and therefore was the one that assumed the responsibility for promoting diamond consumption. A diamond is forever. That is De Beers. Since in the last 10 years or so, 15 years, De Beers has decided to also enter the retail space. Remember, I said earlier that the two most profitable levels of the industry were mining and the high end of retail. And De Beers has decided to enter the high end of retail. It's even established its own retail store on Fifth Avenue, just a couple blocks down from Tiffany's in New York. And it is trying a codification strategy. It is branding its own diamonds. And what it's doing when it's trying to brand its own diamonds is saying, look, no matter where you buy a De Beers diamond, a De Beers retail diamond in a De Beers box, no matter where you do that, it will always be exactly the same. It will be the same quality. It will be the same size. It will be cut exactly the same way. That is an effort to try to brand diamonds as a way of, you might say, overcoming all of the heterogeneity of diamonds. You might say it's De Beers' effort to try to bring computer codification to the diamond industry. Much like that a share of General Electric is just like every other share of General Electric, and therefore I'm happy to buy one remotely. De Beers is trying to say our trademark diamonds are just like every other trademark diamonds, and you can trust us.
And you can trust us, just like you are not buying film, you're buying Kodak when it did exist, or you're not buying a phone, you're buying an iPhone, and you're not searching, you're actually Googling.
Exactly.
And it's the same branding that they would like to benefit from. So there is a certain level of uniqueness in the product. And of course, De Beers would like to be a player, which is one of the largest players in the world and almost deemed as a monopoly by the U.S. government for several decades before they were allowed to come back in as a retailer in this country. The challenge that the intermediaries have, that they're operating in a very small end of the market or the segment of the market. Second, there are just too many of them competing there, and there's always a race to bottom. And the credit is a big factor because it's a very large piece of, or rather purchases that these diamonds, when they change hands, there's also a large value there that is changing hands, or at least large price that is changing hands. So there's even a slight default can knock off your 1% or 2% margin that you may have, and it could suddenly become 100% loss to you.
Yeah, being an intermediary in this business takes a lot of guts. You are engaging in very, very large transactions with margins that really are quite small. You really got to know what you're doing. And it is true that sometimes debts aren't paid because people shirk, people cheat. And the punishments of those kinds of defections are very severe. And that way, the industry has really achieved some kind of remarkable reliability given the threats. But also sometimes people just make miscalculations and they go into default. And one of the consequences of the industry self-policing is that really when you default, you really cannot come back into the industry. And that is why you could say the industry is so fastidious, is so exacting and demanding of its merchants before they earn the kind of trust and credibility that they can to obtain credit from other merchants. Now, what's also interesting is that over the last 10 years, however, it's always been difficult to make money as a diamantaire, as an intermediary. The ones who are good at it have been quite successful and have become quite wealthy. But over the last 10 years, it's become even more difficult. There's been an influx of new diamantaires from India. Palanpuris came in the 80s, but then you've had Marwatis and Kathiawadis entering in the 90s and 2000s. You have had an increase in wholesale prices and a reduction in retail prices. You've had intermediaries both getting squeezed at the wholesale and retail levels and also combating greater levels of competition. And that has pushed a lot of intermediaries to the brink. And it will be very interesting to see in the next 10 years whether these intermediaries can really survive or whether you will see a real dramatic change to the formal economic organization of the industry.
As you mentioned earlier, and it also you have very well explained in the book, is that it is not easy to enter into the diamond trade simply because the responsibilities and onus that it has on these distributors or intermediaries. But at the same time, it is possible for another ethnic network to enter.
That's exactly right. The necessary feature that you need to have as a diamantaire entering as an intermediary, the necessary feature is credibility. You need to be able to credibly promise another diamantaire that you will pay that diamantaire back. You need to be able to purchase things on credit, and therefore you need credibly to be able to say, I will keep my promises. Now, the industry has historically been attributed to saying, look, only trustworthy people enter the industry, and therefore all of us who survive in the industry are very deeply trustworthy. It's important to parse that a little bit. What's really going on is not a certain degree of moral character, but really the ability to say to a possible transactor, if I don't pay you back, severe consequences will happen to me. My family will punish me. I know I'm representing my family's name when I'm entering into this transaction. My community will punish me because everyone in my community knows that my participation in this industry is good for the whole community. And if I cheat somebody, I'm hurting the whole community. So the ability to enter and be credible depends, again, because this is a stateless industry, it depends on how much the diamantaire can assure the other merchants that the diamantaire's family and community will punish that person if the promise is not kept. So in that sense, you can't just come in and tell everybody you're a really good person. You need to have a community and a family backing you with a history of credibility in the industry. Now, that has often meant that the industry is rather closed. You need to know somebody to be able to get into the industry, or you need to be born into the industry. And the truth is, if you go down 47th Street and you ask the average person, when did you get started in the business? How did you get started in the business? The answer invariably will be, well, my parents and my grandparents and my uncles and my cousins were in the industry, and that's how I got in. But what you have seen, and remember what I said earlier, in the 1920s, it was mostly Belgian. In the 1950s and 60s, it was mostly Jewish, and now it's mostly Indian. We have seen changes in the composition of the industry, and that is because even though individuals cannot enter the market, networks can enter the market. Community and ethnic-based networks can enter. And it was only because the Palanpuris were able to say to the other members of the industry, my community, my network will punish me. I have this whole backing of credibility, and they will punish me if I don't keep my promise to you. That is the way the industry has changed. It's because whole networks, whole ethnic networks were able to enter the industry, even though individuals could not.
Within the shadow of the law, but beyond the reach of the courts, and the credit pyramid exists, backed by the family and the community and not just an individual.
Yeah, and what's interesting is it's not even within the shadow of the law. I mean, the term within the shadow of the law suggests that there is something legal. There's a state form of coercion somewhere backing up these transactions, and if push comes to shove, we can ultimately invoke the state. So this really actually is even beyond the shadow of the law. This is, in that sense, it is entirely stateless. It is within the shadow of the community, and within the shadow of the ethnicity and the shadow of the family. Those sources of coercion really are what enable the industry to move forward.
Being an historian and being also a legal professor and understanding of economics, what lessons do you learn from the statelessness or stateless networks or commerces? Because, increasingly the world is becoming, in my opinion, even though we are digital and electronic, but we're increasingly becoming, in some say, stateless. And I'll explain you how. And this may come as a very contradictory to most people's way of thinking. Let's look at transactions between U.S. and China or any other manufacturers, Taiwanese, Koreans. You go on Alibaba, find the supplier based on the reputation. You look at the product catalog, you buy a product, you pay the money in the escrow account or some account, and bang, you are delivered in 10, 15, 30 days, your products, and the money is released. And you have the product. If the product is not to your satisfaction, you reject and your money is safe.
Yeah. I mean, so the lesson that I take away is that markets can look in all sorts of ways. You can organize markets in all sorts of ways. And the way you would want to organize a market depends very specifically on the details, the mechanics of how value is created. You look at the individual diamond transaction, and that will determine what the diamond market looks like. And if you look at the demand and the particulars of, say, the transaction of selling a bar of soap, you will find a very different kind of market structure. So I guess the lesson that I take away is that you can't be orthodox or you can't be dogmatic about the way you think about economics and the way you think about markets, and especially I think the way you think about market transactions, market transactors, market individuals, merchants. There's an enormously interesting set of skills that a diamantaire brings to the marketplace, brings to the diamond industry that makes the diamantaire successful. It certainly is the ability to assess the value of a diamond, to be able to look at it and determine what grade it is, but it also depends on being able to connect with other sources in the industry, determine where buyers will be, what buyers will want. It depends on connecting with other sources of authority in the industry and being able to be credible, maintain one's promise. A lot of it depends on not just what you know, but who you are. And in that sense, if we see in the modern international economy the convergence, or at least the interconnections between manufacturers of all different kinds, manufacturing products of all different kinds, intersecting with consumers of all different kinds, I think we should expect a very heterogeneous, a very dynamic kind of marketplace. Industries will look very different from each other, and they will take hold in different parts of the world by different kinds of people. And it's a wonderful playground for economists, at least economists who do think heterogeneously, try to understand why the world is unfolding the way it is and why markets are unfolding the way they are in formats that are as different as they are from each other. I think it's also a wonderfully useful insight for entrepreneurs, where you don't have to be orthodox or dogmatic about trying to create value. You can be creative. You can think about how you can establish a foothold in a particular market with a particular set of technologies and a particular set of consumers. The other thing, I think, the other takeaway you might say, is that it's a lot of fun just to be curious and try to think about how the world is looking. When you walk down Manhattan and you walk down 47th Street, everybody's mind is wondering, like, why is this so different from the rest of the city? Who are these people walking down the street? Where do they come from? How do they get into the diamond industry? Your curiosity is just very naturally triggered. And maybe the biggest takeaways from this in-depth study at this particular industry that is somewhat idiosyncratic, maybe the biggest lesson simply is markets assume all different shapes and sizes. They have different personalities, and it's wonderfully enriching to just try to figure out what makes them look like the way they do.
The happy story that comes from the diamantery also has a sad side to it. Obviously, you deal with it in the book a little bit about cartelization. There's also an issue of enforcement, tax evasion, and of course, there are other issues that could lead to some violence as well. But more important to the structure of the market, and if you are a government entity or if you're a consumer, you would like to have a little bit of better level playing field, or at least having access to the markets or having the access to the products. How serious is the problem, in your view, the issue of the cartel-like behavior? Is there any resistance to change?
Yeah. So backing up, we shouldn't be romantic about this. I mean, as fascinating as the industry is, we should understand that every form of economic organization, this is kind of a mundane way to put it, but every kind of economic organization has its inefficiencies and its downsides. Certainly, the fact that the industry is stateless also means that the fact that it does not need to rely on the state also means that it can easily hide from the state. And in that sense, there is a certain degree of tax evasion. It's difficult to determine with any extraordinary confidence where diamonds come from. And if we're trying to stop blood diamonds or rebel diamonds, this is an industry that's had a lot of trouble really conforming with certain rules of international trade and even of domestic law. But aside from that, it's important to recognize that the whole source of authority, of coercion that enforces transactions, is the collective mobilization of punishment. So again, the reason a diamantaire is credible is because if the diamantaire breaks the promise, the community will enforce a collective punishment. And that punishment basically comes in the form of a boycott, of an economic boycott. If you break your promise, you will never work in this industry again. And that is a collective mobilization. All the diamantaires will work together, both a tacit and often an explicit agreement with each other, not to do business with someone who has cheated in the past. That's the way both the industry maintains credibility, and it's also the way it induces every individual merchant to maintain credibility. But that whole exercise of authority, of coercion as a group boycott, is also the kind of exercise of authority that we see in cartels. In fact, it is a cartel-like exercise of authority. And cartels have all sorts of undesirable economic consequences, too. They tend to resist change. They tend to resist entry. They tend, to the degree that they can, limit output and elevate prices. Now, there are a lot of ways that this cartel, like the diamond cartel, is unable to inflict harm on consumers. It's very difficult for these intermediaries to restrict output. There are too many of them. It's very difficult for them to restrain prices. Each diamond is very heterogeneous. There have been efforts, and there's some suggestion that there have been some collusive efforts in the traditional way, but those tend to be overwhelmed by other market forces. But there's something also deeply hardwired in this cartel structure that's problematic. Again, what makes a diamantaire successful? Well, in part, it depends on who the diamantaire is, what family the diamantaire is from, what community the diamantaire is from. And that is a structure that, whenever you're rewarding status instead of ability, you're not attracting the top talents. If you're a diamond business, if you're running a diamond business, how do you recruit your next generation of workers? Do you go to Harvard Business School or Stanford Business School? No, because those folks, however smart and innovative they are, nobody will trust them. So instead, you recruit the next generation of business people from your family, because those are the only people who can credibly obtain credit, because they know that you are backing them because you share their name. As a form of economic organization, there is a real difficulty to pursue new business strategies. You're kind of hardwired into an old business strategy. And in that sense, you might say that De Beers' effort to enter retail is the kind of business innovation that the traditional intermediaries are going to have a lot of trouble responding to.
We have been speaking with Barak Richman, the author of Stateless Commerce. Where do you think the diamond industry is heading in the next 10, 20 years? Do you see any technological things on the horizon? Do you see any automation that could change? Do you see any financial markets-driven changes? Or do you see other ethnic networks coming into the play as China and Asia becomes bigger and bigger player in the whole industry?
Well, certainly when Indian merchants, when Gujarati and Palanpuri merchants networks entered the industry, it changed the face of the industry. So the face of the industry in the mid-'80s is very, very different from the way it is now. Do I see other networks entering? Well, it would be hard to imagine other networks would not. But I see changes happening, much more daunting changes possibly happening organizationally and not, as a matter of geography. The influx of new intermediaries and changes that are happening on the wholesale and the retail levels are putting economic strains on the stateless intermediaries in ways that really might push them beyond their sustainability. One's credibility in sustaining the industry is all about responding to the threat that they're going to get kicked out of the industry. And the threat of getting kicked out of the industry is daunting enough to induce people to keep their promises, precisely because staying in the industry long term always assured profitability. Now, if in fact current trends continue where wholesale prices go up, retail prices go down, then there's more competition on the intermediary level, the prospect of long-term cooperation, long-term profits really going to be thinner and thinner. And in that sense, the very core instrument that induces cooperation, that makes people keep their promises, that instrument of coercion might lose its teeth. If every diamantaire is basically making a trade-off between, do I keep my promise today and therefore have a future of business in this industry, or do I steal my diamonds today and just leave the industry and forego all those profits in the future? If the profits in the future are going to be slimmer and slimmer, then the temptation to cheat today is going to be greater and greater. And that will really undermine everything that undergirds the intermediaries, the statelessness the stateless instruments of coercion are going to lose their force. And that could be really significant. And we've started to see some of that. We've started to see degrading trust in the industry. We've started to see, therefore, more vertical integration. A lot of diamond manufacturers, instead of purchasing from intermediaries, are now buying their own mining companies or buying their own distributors. And a lot of mining companies, like De Beers, is now integrating downward into retail. And the more vertical integration we see, the more corporatization of the industry we'll see. And the intermediaries in 47th Street, the Jewish and Palanpuri families that are running the industry, will be in much greater competition with these large corporate entities, with De Beers, with Tiffany's, with the corporate giants of luxury jewelry. And in that sense, you asked me questions long ago about how insurance and investment banking has modernized, has gone away from the personal and towards the electronic or more computer-driven or more corporate-driven. You might be seeing that happening in the diamond industry also. Not so much because the efficiencies of electronic analysis are so great in the diamond industry, but more because the efficiencies of statelessness are becoming less credible. The whole stateless network itself is becoming less credible, and vertical integration is going to start taking its place. So we could see some very dramatic changes in the next 10 to 20 years in the diamond industry.
The consolidation, the corporatization, and the obviously much needed vertical integration will eventually drive many of these intermediaries and lead to a rise of a different kind of organization that will work on a much bigger scale also, but also on a much smaller profit margin.
Well, I mean, it's hard to figure out what the profit margin will be, but certainly we will see the way De Beers is now vertically integrated, the way De Beers mines its own diamonds and sources its own diamonds and monitors the cutting and polishing of its own diamonds and then produces its own jewelry with its own diamonds. That's a very different kind of organization from what happened 10 years ago, where De Beers would only sell to these intermediaries and the diamonds would flow among the intermediaries and make their way to independent jewelry manufacturers. And the way a vertically integrated corporate entity functions is dramatically different from the way a bunch of family businesses interact with each other. And I think that if I understand the diamond industry correctly, that is the trading of one set of efficiencies for another. You will see less matching. You will see the less utilization of human energy to match individual stones with individual buyers. Instead, you will see investments in brands, in standardization, and in the marketing of luxury goods. Is that a happy story or is it a sad story? I don't know. But it is consistent with the story of where we see the modernization and the reorganization of industry after it encounters different economic and technological changes.
And here's the another part of the puzzle is that the most consumers, average person, does not buy diamond. He buys a diamond ring, he buys a diamond, or she buys a diamond jewelry, or families buy different things that have diamond as one of many components in the jewelry, but nobody buys diamond, they buy a jewelry.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, you do see a growing place in the industry for diamonds as investments. And you see some speculation in very large stones, much like you see speculation in gold. What happens on the retail level has always been, you might say, a little window into what motivates our culture. I don't mean to be grandiose when I say that. I just mean to say that, diamond sales have always been a function of marketing. One prominent industry observer called it the diamond invention. There might be some inherent, innate attraction we have with gemstones. I'm sure there is. Gemstones have always been associated with religious deities across the world. There's something magical about them. But in reality, we buy diamonds, especially for engagements, for anniversaries, because marketers have told us that that's what we're supposed to do. There's a reason that De Beers' marketing campaign, A Diamond is Forever, was deemed to be the most successful campaign in the 20th century. There's a reason that in post-World War II Japan, only about 25% of married couples marked their engagement with a diamond ring. And then after a De Beers advertising campaign, that number, 25%, elevated to 75% in about 10 years. we buy diamond rings because we are part of a very, very creative, very, very sophisticated marketing campaign. And that marketing campaign has been changing over the last couple of years. And I think that might explain some changes in the way we buy diamonds. De Beers no longer says a diamond is forever. De Beers now says only a De Beers diamond is worth your love, is worth your investment. De Beers is now not marketing diamonds, but specifically De Beers diamonds. It advertises them as naturally sourced. We're being told that not only should we think about the magic of a diamond, but where the diamond comes from and who has sourced the diamond. We are told that we should think about a natural diamond, not a synthetic diamond. And I think those marketing strategies have changed the way we buy diamonds now. We do think of the location of where they're mined. We think about the governments that have sponsored the mining sectors. And who knows what the world has to come, or who knows what the marketing geniuses on Madison Avenue have in store for us, because that what they have told us has always had significant sway on how we buy diamonds. And as as the industry changes and reorganizes itself, I suspect that the marketing strategies will change also.
So much for the diamond and so much for the book. Tell us a little bit more about where do you get your sparkle? Other than teaching, what else do you do? Or are there more books coming in the pipeline? Or are there any other topics that you're focused on for your future writing?
Yeah, well, I was trained as an organizational economist, and I've always been fascinated with the way things are organized. And that actually was why I was initially attracted to the diamond industry. It posed many challenges and many questions because of its unique organization, the people that were involved, the way things were organized, the way diamonds were sourced and distributed. Its unusual organization always fascinated me, and there are other industries that have kind of caught my attention because of the way they're organized also. A lot of my recent research has involved the healthcare sector, and I've been fascinated and somewhat dismayed at the way the healthcare sector is organized. There are some parallels, you might say, with the diamond industry. That we have a healthcare sector that is very intimately organized around the professionals that organize care. We have a health sector that's organized around scientists, modern medicine, modern physicians, and these sophisticated hospitals in which they assign care. And I'm not entirely sure that's the way things should be organized. It's fascinating to think of how we have been acculturated to think about where we should get health care, how we think about health care, and how we've constructed certain avenues to pay for our health care. So the next project, I think, is thinking about how the current system of organizing our delivery system emerged and what alternative organizational frameworks there might be. One of the great interests in the diamond industry has been how the role of families and ethnicities and religions and ideologies have had significant and continue to have significant economic roles. And this intersection of economics and culture, or economics and ideology, continues to fascinate me. And it makes me think a lot about how either communities and geographies, ethnicities, religious sects, and also professional organizations, how they organize themselves, what motivates, what values are inculcated into individuals, and how that affects their economic behavior. So I often think about the values that doctors have and what that means for the way they conduct themselves. Lawyers, I've thought about rabbis and other clergy members, what values they've been inculcated with and how that affects the way they organize their own markets. Thinking about these intersections through the lens of economics and organizational economics offers a lot of really interesting and curious questions to pursue. So that's what I hope to do.
Fascinating. Stateless Commerce is published by Harvard University Press, and I would recommend people to go and read it. Those who would like to understand how markets are organized, how they are structured, and how diamond industry offers one way of looking at it. Thank you very much for your time and your comments. And if you do end up writing another book, please do talk to us. We would love to hear about your book as well.
I'd be delighted. Thanks so much for having me again.
Thank you. Thank you.